Do you want your business to grow faster? Are you open to new and out-of-the-box ways to drive revenues and increase value? How do you imagine the most successful entrepreneurs and business leaders double, triple, or expand their businesses tenfold or more? This is a weekly podcast featuring conversations with business owners, executives, and leaders as we reveal behind-the-scenes details that give you, our listeners, the confidence to pursue your own deal-driven growth. On the show, we discuss a huge variety of deals, everything from large, complex mergers and acquisitions, capital raising, joint ventures, strategic alliances, real estate, affiliate and sponsorship deals, and more, including smaller deals that you can do without significant capital. My name is Corey Kupfer, and I've been supporting deal-driven growth for businesses for over 35 years as a successful entrepreneur, professional negotiator, and attorney. My goal is to help you strategize, plan for, find, and complete deals that will help your company grow faster. Welcome to the DealQuest podcast. Let's get started. DealQuest community, I'm so excited to introduce you to a remastered episode of the DealQuest podcast. The podcast has grown so much. We started it about 5 years ago now, at least at the point I'm recording this. In the beginning, had maybe 60 or 80 listeners per episode. We now have many multiples of that. In fact, we've got almost 100 times that. And I realized that there were so many great interviews I did early on in the podcast. In fact, in the first year of the podcast, it wasn't even called DealQuest. It was called Fueling Deals until we rebranded it. And we interviewed some amazing entrepreneurs and deal makers and, just amazing stories, amazing content. And I know that so many of our listeners have joined us over the last several years and may not have heard some of those earlier episodes from 5 years ago, 4 years ago, even 3 years ago. So we have picked the best of those old episodes, and the advice and the stories and the experiences are timeless. So we've remastered them, made sure the audio is great, and put in our new intro and outro, that kind of stuff. And we're going to be re-releasing some of these amazing episodes. So look out for them from time to time. And here's one coming up right now. Ramia Mariel El Agamy Khan is part of a second generation of her family business and fulfills the roles of CEO of Orbis Terra Media, editor-in-chief of Tharawat Magazine, and host of the podcast, The Family Business Voice, and Women in Family Business. She is dedicated to bringing the power of content and technology to individuals and business to unlock their growth. And along with her today, we are blessed to have her sister. So we have two guests on the podcast today. Her sister, Agamy, who is a lawyer, entrepreneur, and governance expert, currently the general manager of the Tharawat Family Business Forum, the private network and knowledge hub for family-owned companies in the Middle East and North Africa. Both of their full bios are going to be in the show notes. Definitely check them out. Super impressive. And I'm excited to have Ramia and Farida on the DealQuest podcast. Welcome.
Thanks, Corey. Thanks for having us.
Hi, Corey. Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, it's fantastic to have you both. We were talking in the pre-show about all of the things that you're involved in and content creation and family businesses, and the fact that at least Ramia and I are getting into Clubhouse and all these wonderful combination things. And, and we'll talk about some of that, not all of that on the podcast here. But before we get into that, and also how the types of deals that you get involved in and have seen, I want to take you both back to when you were growing up as little girls, and you were maybe 8, 10, 12 years old. What did you want to be? Because with most of my guests, I say because I doubt it is whatever they're doing now, because it almost never is. Or in your case, it is a family business. So I'm sort of wondering whether you did think you were going to be doing something along the lines that you are now, or whether it was something totally different when you were little kids.
I'm totally going to take my cue from my big sister, Corey, because I'm really worried about saying something wrong. So Farida's going to go first on this one. And then I'm going to take my censorship cue from her. And that's because that's how family businesses work. See, that's why I wanted her on the show, so she couldn't.
Hierarchy is everything.
Hierarchy is everything. You have to respect the authority matrix here. So,
absolutely.
Farida, what did you want to be when you were growing up?
What a good question. I haven't thought about that for a very long time. I think for me, very early on, I was very interested in kind of societal questions. So I was a very nerdy 8-year-old, and my father, so our father actually, I do.
Thank you for sharing.
Yes. Our father actually has a very interesting career, but one of the things that he studied was archaeology. And I've always wanted to be an archaeologist. And he used to take us on hikes where we would go to old digging sites and kind of, see if there was something left or some shards from a Roman digging that archaeologists would have left behind. So that kind of really inspired me. And of course, being half Egyptian, our travels to go see family in Cairo would also take us to some of these amazing cultural heritage sites, where then our dad would explain to us, how to look at such an ancient site and understand how society would have worked 5,000, 3,000 years ago. So for me, it was definitely archaeology. And I think at some point, I also was very interested in politics very early on as well.
You still are.
And I still am very political. I'm a highly political person. But so, yeah, I think those would be the two ideas that would come to mind for me.
Great. And Ramia?
Actually, you sound so like you're an 8-year-old who had it super together.
I probably had it more together than today. So
I think that was true. That I wish to go back to that level of clarity. Actually, I love it.
Absolutely.
So no, I mean seriously though, I think that I'm probably so we're 3 sisters, right, in the family business. To be clear, we just couldn't squeeze in another guest on your podcast. We felt that would be a bit much. The 3 of us, like it's kind of overwhelming. So there's only 2. But we're 3 sisters, and I think of the 3 of us, I probably was the one who kind of always imagined working with Dad somehow. I think it was because I used to miss him a lot when he used to travel a lot when we were kids. And I just always imagined that if I could just carry one of those suitcases, even if it were empty, and put a big calculator inside, I could go with him. And I think it was like, for me, later on, I realized it probably was like sort of the entrepreneurial gene that was there from the start. I think I was never meant to do anything else but to build businesses and sort of like be an entrepreneur. I love it so much. But yeah, so I think like just that idea of like kind of working with Dad or going on these travels with Dad was a very predominant motivation. And yeah, I think, we opened several businesses as kids as well. So my younger sister and I were very active 8-year-olds. Like we had like travel agencies. There was a detective agency. It was a very busy childhood, Corey. Like, there was a lot of productivity going on. Even that, we could have actually known that this was going to turn into a family business in the end, like all of that productivity. So this first segment should tell people a lot about our characters. Actually, the sister has it together, and then the other one has like no idea what she's gonna do. So yeah, cool. Next question, Corey.
I love it. I love it. And just to give people some context, because you mentioned that you're half Egyptian. I know the other half is Dutch, right? And then, and now you currently split time between the UAE and Switzerland. So give people like a little geographic grounding in where you grew up and your background and where you are now and that kind of stuff.
Well, you pretty much said it all. So our father is Egyptian from Cairo, and our mother is from close to Amsterdam in the Netherlands. They met in France, and then they went to live in Switzerland. So we were actually, all 3 of us were born and brought up in Switzerland, and not in one of the fancy places like Zurich or Geneva, but really in proper rural Switzerland. And so Switzerland is really kind of our home. This is where we belong to a certain extent. But then, of course, when you have these international roots, the world is your oyster to a certain extent. So we all 3 studied in the UK at some point during our studies. And yeah, then in 2008, we started living partially in the UAE and started building 2 of our companies there, between there and Switzerland. And then, of course, Ramia got married, and her husband is from Pakistan. So that
trail.
We needed to add some Asian influence.
There's
not enough diversity.
Corey, we just decided that my future children, we want to confuse them so much. It's going to be fun watching them having massive identity crises. I think this was just the goal for our own entertainment. Confuse the future children.
I got it. So they should be planning the therapy budget now. Right?
Exactly.
That's the trust fund that we established.
This is why we build wealth, actually, in anticipation of this issue.
Yeah. So, I love it.
Citizens of the world, in short, yes. Citizens of the world.
The other question I often ask opening the podcast, and you can take it in whatever order you would like. I don't know if it was together or separate. But what would be the first deal of any type, whether it was something small when you were a kid or something you think about as an adult that comes to mind that you did?
That's an interesting question. I think for me, it probably would be when I was in the law firm. So I did my bar exam in Switzerland and practiced law in Switzerland for a while. And I think, Switzerland is an interesting country, Corey. We are, in a funny way, we are very entrepreneurial. I mean, we have a very strong middle class. Many of those people are either self-employed or, have their own businesses. So it's a very much an SME-focused country. But would I say it's a deal-friendly country? Probably less than the US. Yeah. So in terms of, the way I would imagine that the word deal provokes something in a listener from the US, it's going to be very different for someone in Switzerland. So growing up, our father was a very traditional entrepreneur, building his own business, in quite a conservative industry as well. So there were no deals, I would say, per se, in our close family environment. So for me, the first exposure would have been when I started helping clients in several areas. But one of them would actually, funnily enough, was a family business here in the capital that was trying actually to get out of a deal. So that was my first experience with the deal. Yeah. So it was a family business. They were third generation, very interesting. One of the uncles had kind of set up a deal with a Russian company. And then his nephew kind of came in literally at 5 to 12, saw the details of the deal and had to do anything he could to stop this because it clearly was a very bad deal. So that's when we as lawyers got involved and, tried to support his narrative in terms of trying to warn the uncle that this was going to go really, really south.
I've never actually thought of that before, So Corey, just so you know, your pity for me, reaches its climax. Both my sisters are attorneys, okay? Just so you know, I'm in the middle. Wow. And it's really, it's a scary, scary place to be. And no, but actually I've never thought of it that way until you mentioned that. But it's so interesting because for you guys, deals are actually always associated with business, isn't it? Because it's from deals, there's so much business.
Well, yeah, of course.
Lawyers, right? I never even realized the connection, but it's true, of course. It's so, that's massive. Mm-hmm. Because you almost always, at some point, you need legal support to a certain extent, right? So
most probably, yeah.
Interesting.
Love it.
Yeah.
And anything come to mind for you, Ramia?
Ooh, I think I've formally been making deals all my life. I think when you're an entrepreneur, I think it's kind of part of the package, isn't it? Because you start with nothing. So everything is a barter, a negotiation and reaching agreements and making deals. And initially those deals, it's really interesting. I feel in the beginning of a company, when you start building a company, you usually end up bartering and making deals based on skills exchange. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And then they sort of they grow in size and significance when there is the monetization side of it that comes into it. So I think honestly, the moment, I guess you could say that the moment you decide to build a business or decide to run a business, you make a deal with yourself that it's part of your day to day really. And I would say it's been interesting for us because our work allows us. So I've interviewed hundreds of family businesses. Farida is the GM of probably the largest network of family businesses in the Middle East today. And we get so much exchange and so many discussions with other family firms. And I feel it's so interesting to see how the family business as a construct is actually, it's a constant negotiation internally and externally, right? And family businesses are known to be super embedded into their regional context. They're usually people who carry large, really, really strong reputations, are very attractive, are magnetic almost for deal makers to find. People always want to make deals with family businesses because they're very attractive deal counterparts because usually they're stable, they think long term, there's that sense of, if the family is involved, there's skin in the game. So I think that, we informally talk about this all the time, don't we? Okay, you got a deal pushed your way. What do you think? Should we share the risk? Should we go in together and stuff like that? So amongst family businesses, I think this is a fairly frequent discussion, actually, if you think about it. Yeah.
Yeah, no question about it. And listen, I look at the family business itself as a deal because business partnerships, right?
Yeah.
And, multi-owner companies, whether they're family or not, there's a deal that needs to be made amongst owners, right, even within a company. So that's a fundamental deal. I want to hit on just a couple of what I look at as, at least in my experience, as sort of myths of family business so we can get, if anybody is sitting there with some things in their heads, I want to clear them a little bit. And then I want to get more specifically into into some of the conversations of deals as they relate to family businesses and otherwise. So first of all, you have used the word entrepreneur, termed yourself an entrepreneur within a family businesses, but some people who don't know it well, they question that. I, for many, many years, was a member of Entrepreneurs Organization, president of the New York chapter. I taken a couple of years off, but I'm probably going to come back. And, it's an international organization with chapters all over the world. And one of the differences that we see is most of the members in the U.S. are first-generation entrepreneurs, or if they're parents were entrepreneurs, they're not in the family business. They're, whereas in, for example, the Middle East, in a lot of Asia, Southeast Asia, even a lot of Latin and South America, a lot of actually other parts of the world, many of the members are second, third generation family businesses. And there was always this question about, are they entrepreneurs, right? Because, and I happen to know many of them and know that in my mind, they are definitely entrepreneurs, because it's not like they're in many cases. I mean, sometimes they are, but in most cases, I don't see them just coming in to a well-established business and being a manager and just operating that business as it existed. As it existed, when they're
let the troll accounts thing begin.
Right. So you want to speak to that? Because I think that's a myth that sort of second or third generation family folks are not entrepreneurs, but you tell me your experience. Obviously, you swim in this world, every day.
I don't, maybe we should make that distinction. I think there's a real technical distinction between talking about a family business, family enterprise, and an enterprising family. I mean, I think for both Farida and I, it is inextricably linked. When you talk about entrepreneurship and family business, I mean, entrepreneurship is not only the origin of any family business, but it's also usually the force that propels it forward. Like, every generation, there's this saying that like every generation should treat its family business, however well established, as a startup, and basically really like question everything, like, rejuvenate, etc., and like put that energy in. Not that every generation needs a founder, but there's something to be said about that. In our particular case, I think we really qualify as what you'd call sort of an enterprising family, because we've gone beyond sort of like just working in one business, right? Like we're not just like that one business that has our name above the door, that one factory, but we've gone into several different companies, building several different companies, all within the family ownership. It's all governed by the same family. But that's why we're absolutely never afraid to use the word entrepreneurship, because we understand that any endeavor starts with that impulse of the entrepreneur. Now, the beauty of, I think, being part of an enterprising family as opposed to really being solo is that there's the heritage, in the sense like there's the history, and you learn from the history of the past, of the previous generations. And you have honestly, you just have like the moral and emotional support of the family around you, and you have the rest of the family involved, right? Like, what did you say?
Let me go out on a limb here. I would even say that family business is an extreme version of entrepreneurship. It's like the extreme sport of entrepreneurship to a certain extent, and I'll explain why. On the one hand, you have extreme advantages, obviously, right? You might have already infrastructure set up. You might have resources at your disposal. You might have already a very strong goodwill with your stakeholders and strong legacy that you can, build on going forward. But then you also have the downsides, right? That legacy can weigh enormously. It can be like one of my friends, a third generation family business member, once said, sometimes I feel like I inherited a backpack full of stones, and I'm trying to drag that around with me, being very aware that I cannot get rid of one of the stones because they're all part of my legacy. And then you have the reality of, for example, people always referring to your predecessor as the one person that made it, and the one person that was, exactly, the ghosts around the table. There's a huge field in family business that talks about, what legacy does to a person taking over an existing business. And yet both the positives and the negatives taken into account, you are an entrepreneur, because what you're essentially doing, you have to look at your resources and you have to apply, risk behavior in order to achieve growth. And I think ultimately the behavior is exactly the same. It just comes with a very different context. And that's why sometimes I do say that it's the bungee jumping of entrepreneurship, because it is a bit more extreme, even though entrepreneurship by itself as a normal concept is already difficult enough. But it adds a dimension that is emotional, that is unexpected. And talking about deals, Corey, every single morning you enter your family business, it's a emotional negotiation with your family members. Yes. However good, however strong your relationship with each other, you are constantly negotiating. You are constantly adjusting behavior. You are constantly trying to figure out how to marry the aspect of you having bonds that go beyond the workplace, but also having to display professional behavior and having the opportunity to, for example, a big topic here is accountability. How can I tell my sister that I adore, that, we've been through so much together? How can I tell her that, she's accountable for something and point to her that perhaps she has not performed? I'm not telling you something.
Are you trying to say something? Wait, stop, Corey. Can this wait until tomorrow's briefing, please?
Well, there you go. Pointing case, Corey. Pointing case.
So is it a hypothetical, or are we having an?
She's
no
like
comment.
passive aggressively pointing fingers. I will bring this up in the family council tomorrow, just so you know. So, but I think it's such an interesting point you're raising. I do think it's like how people say, when you want to be successful in business, you have to leave your ego at the door. And in family business, that's true. Plus, you have to leave your childhood preconceptions at the door as well. There's a lot, actually, that you have to leave at the door. The door frame is full of stuff that you have to leave there. And I think that's a deal with yourself, basically, that you have to reach. But also, because the role, I'd love to hear also, Corey, for me, one of the big topics that I like to connect with anything we think about is ego. And I think in deal making, that's also such a big thing, isn't it? And it's also a really big thing in family business. And I always feel like ego plays such a big role in both these areas and how successful we can be, right? If that element is sort of in check and has its right place, then both these things become much more successful.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, it's interesting. I talk a lot about ego in my Authentic Negotiating book, and on how it's one of the top 5 reasons that negotiations fail. Is when ego gets involved, so definitely believe that. And it's interesting because everything you talked about, and you mentioned something, you talked about family counseling. So number one, the stakes are so much higher in family businesses, right? Because it's not just if the business falls apart or the business partnership falls apart or there's tension, it doesn't just affect the business, but it's hard not to have it come into the personal and the family relationship, right? And then, so it makes it even more important. So I know a subject that we discussed very briefly in the pre-interview, and you especially, I think, Farida, spent a lot of time on, which is governance, right? Governance is important in any company, but certainly in family businesses, I think it's even more important, right?
Oh, absolutely. If we look at, I always try to break governance down into its kind of what I see as its 3 constituting parts, which is your vision, what do you want to achieve, the roles that you have to assign to the people in your group or team or family in order to achieve that goal, and then accountability. So how do we make sure we measure performance? Now, if you break governance down to these 3 principles and you apply this to everything that you do, it becomes very quickly apparent that in family firms, the layers of governance are much more complex. And the complexity comes because of the family element. You have to, I always give the non-family audiences the example, just a little kind of exercise to do. I say, if you imagine the most difficult professional situation you've ever been in your life, take a moment to imagine that. Then imagine the most difficult family relationship you have in your life at the moment. And then you put those 2 together every single day of your professional life. So that's family business. And that's what makes it so extreme. That is what makes it so difficult, because the emotional toll that certain family situations can take on you is much more than you would expect. And I have to say that that's why governance in family firms is essential, but so difficult. Everybody can do corporate governance. Everybody, it's science, it's policy, it's regulated to a certain extent. There's legal implications that you can just follow. And, it's something that is pretty set in stone. When you look at your ownership also has a couple of legal, implications, and you can kind of follow some guidelines there with, of course, a little bit of freedom to arrange as you wish. But what is absolutely never organized is the family governance side. There are no laws that prescribe to you whether you should have a family council or not. Pretty much every corporate law will tell you that you need a board of directors in your company, or that you are obliged to have a shareholders meeting once a year. Nobody tells a family firm that they need a council to discuss family matters. Mm-hmm. So if you leave that to too late in your family's history and you need to then play catch up, sometimes it actually is too hard for the family to get used to regulating their behavior as a family. So this is where I think governance has a lot of complexity. But it makes it fascinating, but it is very, very complex.
And it impacts hugely, right? Like on the ability to make decisions or to actually make deals outwardly.
Oh, absolutely.
Because if you cannot come to that agreement internally, it will defer everything. Like that misalignment internally will defer it will defer your growth. It will defer your ability to seize opportunities. We've seen this last year with COVID. Clearly those families have strived that have their decision-making aligned and that have found in your words, Corey, that have struck some sort of a deal internally, if you will, on how this is going to go down. And that has eased their negotiation with the uncertainty that they've been faced with last year, which we really can categorize as force majeure, that has impacted absolutely everybody. And so I think that this is why I love it when you talk about the governance side of things, because I think it's this principle of having your house in order, even at the most basic level. And in family businesses, we like to also do a lot by handshake and by just it's implied and stuff like that. But when push comes to shove, and especially when the family is actually seeking out bigger opportunities, when you're after bigger deals, when you want to when you really are ambitious about your growth goals, you cannot try that. You cannot do that without facing the internal situation first, right? You cannot do that without having your house in order, or at least you can't do it sustainably. It's eventually going to crumble. I mean, we've seen examples that actually became really big, you're right, but then eventually crumbled because the house wasn't in order internally. So I think it's super important to connect it with the governance theme, actually, yeah.
Yes. And let me talk about what could theoretically be, an ultimate deal for a family business. And I will say I did listen to a little part of your episode with Ramia, with our common friend, Dov Baron, on his podcast. We spoke about this a little bit. I so agree with you. This misperception, or this judgment that people have when, family businesses don't make it through the third generation, and there are some statistics about that, no question. There's some math on that, some stats on that. But as you pointed out on Dov's show, that can happen for so many reasons, right? Sometimes family businesses don't quote unquote survive because maybe they sold, right? Or maybe, and the big point you made, which I love, was that how many businesses last that long? Even so, even if they fall apart after 3 generations, they've accomplished so much more than anybody else. Well, but I do want to talk about sort of that decision. And, I have a theory on this that, some people say, you get further away from the founder or you have generations that are entitled and that's why these businesses fail. And listen, sometimes obviously you see examples of that, in some situations. But I also think part of it is just math in my mind, meaning that most people have more than one child. So every generation you go down, it becomes exponential in the number of people, at least who have beneficial ownership, interest in the company. And frankly, it just gets more complex and it's tougher for a company or a family business to support, when it had to support the founder and their family, it's one thing. And then when it went to the next generation, which might be 2 or 3 kids and then their families, now we've gotten exponential. You go to the next generation, you could be supporting, 10 or 12 or 16, families. And it just gets harder and harder for a business to support that, especially if it hasn't been entrepreneurial with the next generations and expanding it. So ultimately, often it comes to a point at some point in the family businesses, whether it makes sense or whether you can maintain it. And sometimes there's differences of points of view, whether you should sell outside or maybe just bring in outside management and keep it, family owned in whole or in part. Can you talk a little bit about, because you deal with, you have personal family business experience, but you also have interviewed and deal with hundreds of family businesses. What has your experience been in so the evaluation of that ultimate potential deal on whether you keep the business in the family or whether you sell it or bring in outside capital or even just outside management?
I think it's a very interesting point you make here. And it definitely is part of I would almost say a little bit the bad rap that family businesses get, specifically young family business members, right? So when I say I work with family businesses and I speak to people who have nothing to do with family businesses, they right away imagine, the 25-year-old with a Maserati, cruising through London. Like that's kind of the image that people come up with, right? Now, I'm not saying that those don't exist, and I'm not saying that that is not something that, is part of a reality. But I mean, I don't have statistics, but I would say the large majority of next generation members, even from leading large corporations, actually are very aware of the responsibility that they have. Yes. They are extremely, extremely aware that it's as I said before, the backpack full of stones. And however glamorous their life might look from the outside, there is a very clear responsibility that comes their way. Now, one thing that we always talk about in our association, which I think, in Europe is done a bit better, but not very much in the Middle East, is the difference between succession planning for the management, for executives, for the entrepreneur, right? The person who has the entrepreneurial acumen, which also, in my opinion, is quite a matter of luck, whether each generation has that one or two or three or four people who have that acumen, that can have the skill set to guide this family business forward. So the difference between the successor in the executive role versus the successors on the ownership role. And I think there is a lot of work that needs to be done to clarify for people that you might not necessarily be an entrepreneur by nature. And that is okay, even if you are born into an entrepreneurial family. Nobody can basically blame you for not being entrepreneurial. That is not something you can influence. There's nature versus nurture. There's this whole study of where does entrepreneurial behavior start. But I think you cannot blame an individual for perhaps not having the inclination to be an entrepreneur. But what you can do is explain to that person that, you have been given this responsibility. You probably have benefited from being part of a family that has a well-run or a successful business. Now, as a family, we are going to do everything we can to shape you into a responsible, good owner. And that doesn't have to be a full-time job, but it will always mean that as long as you want to benefit from this organization, you will have to give a certain input, a certain type of input. That input needs to have a quality. And what we are trying to advocate is that we make a very big distinction between ownership succession and executive succession or management succession.
Yes.
And, if we do that properly, there are roles for everybody. I am of the opinion that you can educate pretty much anyone to become a good owner, because it is a role that has beautiful facets. It's a role that can be extremely creative. It's a role that can be supportive, that can be, even inspiring. And you can even, if you have entrepreneurial inclinations, you can even, use those. But there has to be a very big distinction, specifically the moment you shift from the first to the second generation. Because typically this is where, and I always try to explain to people who are in the succession moment, specifically from the single entrepreneur to their next generation, to the second generation. You have to imagine that one person has fulfilled between 5 to 10 different roles for this organization to thrive. Right? They are the salesperson. They are the creative person. They are the people person. They are the leader, the visionary. It is very unlikely that you will have someone who can take over those 10 roles embodied in one person, right? Yes. That is very unlikely. So as a founder, you need to be aware that there will be not one person who can probably take it over. So that you have to establish through governance a system whereby some of those aspects that you have taken over or that you have naturally, created for yourself, being taken over by a system. And then the next generation can come in with their own unique skill sets, which they inherently have, and then start using those to create a new value for the company. So this is a little bit how I see that challenge that you described.
Yeah. Thank you. I think that's great insight. Let's take a break from the show for a minute so I can tell you about an incredible resource my team and I have put together for you. Secrets of Deal-Driven Growth, Creative Ways to Grow Your Business Even in Challenging Times, is a powerful ebook that helps you take DealQuest podcast episodes and apply them to your own life and business. This is the ideal tool for anyone looking for creative ways to grow as deal makers, and you can get yours now. It's as easy as heading to coreycupfer.com/workbook and downloading your copy. While you're there, you can also consider joining our dynamic deal-driven community of founders, experts, small business owners, and entrepreneurs. Now back to the show.
I want to shift us to another area of deals that we see with families. And that is, as I've mentioned to you and as my audience knows, I have this sort of a niche where I do a lot of work with people in financial services, wealth management, and that includes family offices, which are becoming more prevalent here in the U.S. and are certainly prevalent around the world. And in those family offices, sometimes what those offices are doing is investing in other people's companies, right? Not just in the family business. And sometimes the multi-generational wealth, gets managed through those family offices. And of course, they invest in various ways, but one of the ways is doing deals. And I know you all have some exposure and experience with that. So talk to us about what you're seeing there.
Mm-hmm. Should I take it? So I think what's interesting in the family office field, first of all, I try to always clarify that for us in Europe and in the Middle East, I wouldn't exclude the UK a little bit because I think the UK and the US have had quite similar developments when it came to family offices. But, the family office concept is very Anglo-Saxon, and I think it arrived a little bit later to continental Europe and is actually just arriving, I would say, over the past 10 decades probably in the Middle East. So it's interesting for us, from an academic perspective to observe how that model of a private wealth management structure is now starting to be implemented around the world. And it has kind of quite different, it starts looking very different. And I like that because I think the early family offices outside of the US really tried to replicate the typical US model, which is, first generation entrepreneur, exponential growth, exit probably still within the first generation, perhaps at the latest second generation, and then the management of those assets long term. Now, in Europe and in the Middle East, it's kind of different. We are still very much in the, operational family business field. So yes. Owners are still very much operational. Now, what we see, however, is that there definitely is this tendency that operating owners, whilst they still are executives in their companies, are starting to establish family offices. Now, these family offices, literally, I've seen everything from there is an extra accountant sitting in the accountant's pool, and he's kind of the family office, all the way to a super sophisticated professional setup. So we see kind of an evolution of that structure. And I think what I find very, very interesting is that, of course, those family offices are starting to display similar behaviors with regards to investment strategies. They have their portfolios set up. They have their asset allocation nicely balanced. Very often, if I look at the Middle East, for example, with its volatility, geographical diversification is really, really important. So there's all these topics. But what I see now is that in the next generation, in the younger generation of these still operational family businesses, so we still haven't exited those. We're still managing factories and, trading businesses. But we are now seeing a generation that says, hang on a second, I'm going to take my dividends and I'm going to actually set up a little investment office of my own. And I think the attraction of, or the I would call it attraction of VC, specifically of VC investing, has done a lot for those next generations to look at investment as, on the one hand, an opportunity to kind of realize their own, vision of where the world is going and the companies they would like to be involved with. But now we also see a sort of corporate VC behavior where family businesses are starting to realize our innovation pace is too slow. So how I'm going to innovate is through investment, direct investments in startups. So these are two developments that are fairly recent.
And I think what's really interesting about the more recent emergence, basically, of the single family office, let's be very clear, the single family office in Middle East, Southeast Asia. And we just did a special collection on family offices in a Barrel magazine that was published last week. And we combined, it was interesting. We did interviews with people from the US, Europe, Iraq, and India. And so it was really interesting to see everyone's take on this. And one of the most interesting interviews we did was actually with Jay Bhupani from India, who explained also about the mindset shift from a family business or an enterprising family towards like decision making in the family office, right? Like, so what you have to learn, that distinction between when you are making business operational decisions and when you are making wealth management decisions, right? Such a big shift, he was it was lovely entry. I really recommend everyone read it because he's being so candid about like how, as an entrepreneur, you come in with those expectations. You're used to just like getting on with things and just doing these things. And wealth management is such a different activity. And I think, and the types of deals that are open to you via the family office are very different than the types of deals that are open to you via an operating business. Of course, I think there's a huge cultural shift. And I actually think that this is also one of those situations where I actually do not necessarily think that the family member who is the best executive for the operating business necessarily would make the best family office.
Yes. Absolutely. No, of course.
I really 100%. Think that those are two
different skill sets
of temperaments. Yeah. So I feel like, and I always feel like that's kind of like, it's interesting. Creating a family office, interestingly, also like really opens up a whole, as you said, involving the next generation. It opens up a whole host of new potential roles for family members, which I think is amazing, right? Like, because family offices are also known to be like usually a lot of families' first foray into structured philanthropy, which a lot of next gens are super excited about, right? Like, and they would never operate in whatever business is still operating, basically. They would never be interested in that industry, but they love what they can do via the family office. And just to your point before as well, Corey, I just wanted to mention that because we all know I went on a rant on Dove's podcast, actually two, like he's just mentioning one, he's being nice about it. So, and Dove lets me rant, which is why I love him so much. So basically, I went on this rant about the longevity discussion as well. And I think it's actually interesting because for me, it links very much with the family office, right? Like, so it's just the fact that a lot of people have this misconception that the longer a family business exists and is established, that somehow they automatically become stronger, things should be becoming easier. But as Farida explained, you have to understand how many factors change on average around the business just in the scope of 10 years. That's not even half a generation.
Yes.
That's why so many businesses fail after 10 years, right? Like most of them fail after, most of them don't even make it out of the startup phase, let alone last like 60, 70 years. I think the reason why family businesses get a bad rap actually for that, like get judged more for like, failing and then the next gen gets sort of like blamed and that whole entitlement discussion, whether true or not, comes forth, is actually because the outside world really loves the family business. And actually the outside world sort of society really loves family wealth and family businesses because it inspires them. There's a sense of stability.
But there's like less family drama.
They also love family drama.
There's a telenovela aspect of,
and there's, it is so much drama. I mean, our family's like so you walk into a soap opera every day. Like, it's fantastic. We should sell the rights to it. It's fantastic. But I think, I just think it's very, I'm very, very passionate about this because you cannot romanticize this, right? Like, this is it's business. We also don't walk around constantly thinking of ourselves as family offices or family businesses. We're entrepreneurs, we're wealth managers. We are what we are. We do our work. But I think what's important to understand is, especially in this current context, I feel like I'm a big advocate of telling every family that we encounter, and they tell us as well, look, especially in these circumstances that we're facing right now, where a lot of things will change and have changed absolutely forever. You should feel comfortable to make the choices that you need to make without feeling that this is failure or without feeling that this is you letting previous generations down, because that's nonsense. Every generation needs to make the best possible decisions within the context that is given it. Sure. Yes. You know what I mean? And I think that's a super important message to send out there, because this nostalgia ultimately leads to the family being ruined entirely, even though maybe, as Corey, probably making a better, there could be a better deal out there than waiting for total ruin because you couldn't you couldn't figure it out, basically. So that's what I'm very passionate about putting out there.
No question. And listen, think about, there's a few things that I parallel that you said, Ramia, that, you look at non-family businesses, right? First of all, people judge family businesses, but look at some of the top companies, and whether you want to talk about in the S&P index, public companies, whatever. I mean, many of them weren't around 25 years ago. Forget 3 generations ago, right? And people moving out. So even at that level, non-public companies, finance companies, whatever. I mean, you look at whatever, Apple, Google, Microsoft, Tesla, whatever. These are, I mean, and the corresponding companies that, whether it's, who knows, U.S. Steel or whatever it is, who moved out. So it's interesting. You don't hear that kind of judgment, for those kind of companies. That's number one. And then the other thing is sort of going back to the family office discussion. I'm interested in this international perspective because I think it's a great distinction that it is more common, although obviously not 100% on either side, but more common in the U.S. for families when they have an exit to then take that money and create a family office and invest that. Whereas in a lot of other parts of the world, there's, the families are still operating. How does that affect what they're investing in? Because although it's not always the case, I find many family offices in the U.S. end up, because they have sold their business in a particular industry, that's the industry they know, and they will often invest in that industry or in adjacent businesses to that industry because that's where their expertise is. But obviously, if you're still running an operating company, there are times when that would make sense to invest in adjacent or whatever, but also you're not going to invest in directly, or I shouldn't say that. Sometimes it makes sense, but very often there's at least considerations on whether you would invest in any kind of competitive company, right? So do you see these family offices in, the Middle East, in Europe, et cetera, UK, wherever it is, investing, looking to branch out and diversify much more? Or are they investing in areas adjacent to their core businesses, or is it a mix?
Well, it's very difficult to say. It's a very interesting question. I'm actually quite fascinated by this question. And it's something that I feel, specifically in the Middle East and even Europe, I feel we're missing a little bit of data. We're actually missing a lot of data, that really starts giving us a proper image of the investment behavior of family offices. I'm talking obviously of single family offices, or even, just individuals coming from family business backgrounds that are investing their private wealth, perhaps not even, instrumentalized or through a vehicle. So it's very interesting to see how, on the one hand, people seem to be extremely opportunistic and really looking at what's flying, where's the best deal of the moment. People are networking as well. And you have to see that in the Middle East, obviously, your network has always been, that was the main asset that you would have. And it's a society that is extremely dependent on personal relationships, trust, long-term trust, right? So we transfer relationships across generations. So I think that's very important to understand. But now, obviously, with the fast-moving society that we have today, sometimes those traditional behavioral patterns cannot be applied anymore. So what we see in investment is a very opportunistic behavior. It's, I happen to have access to a deal. I happen to have access to an opportunity, and I'll just go for it because it just makes mathematical sense, right? The risk is fine. The returns are fine. This makes sense for me. Then you have the people who are a little bit more strategic, and you've basically mentioned it already. On the one hand, you have people who say, I need to diversify away from my core business. I need to make sure that I don't have my private assets exposed to the same cycles as my core business. And that's why I'm going into a completely different direction. So I would say that's one way of investing. The other way is the one that you've mentioned too, which is, I know, let's say, shipping. My family has been in shipping for 80 years. We lived shipping, we breathed shipping. So if I'm going to invest and I want to know that I know where I'm, how successful I can be in a certain asset class, I'm actually going to stick to anything related to shipping because that's what I know. Now, I think what's going to happen is that we'll probably see with family businesses that still have existing family operating businesses, we're going to kind of see a split. We're going to see a hybrid behavior. On the one hand, I would imagine that we will see a lot more of corporate investments, corporate VCs that are going to come up, whereby these operating businesses, as I said just before, are going to diversify and innovate through direct investments in startups within their industry.
Yes.
But then I would say that on the private side, on the family office side, I think that we are going to see more of a diversification, both, by the way, geographical and sector-wise. So it might also be that they say, okay, I'm not going to invest in shipping, for example, in Norway because I'm a Norwegian family business. I've always been in shipping in Norway, but actually I'm going to invest in shipping in Africa because it's geographically diversified. So I am going to not be exposed to the same risk patterns. So this is how I would kind of, in short, summarize the trends that I see, but I would love to see more research on this because I think this is going to be extremely important going forward. And it is changing the entire business landscape and the entire landscape of, how SMEs or small businesses and startups are able to thrive or not. So I think, especially in the Middle East, the allocation of private wealth is actually a huge driver for economic growth if it's done in a smart way.
Yeah, and it's interesting because obviously, one of the difficulties in getting that kind of data is that these are privately held, family. There's not a lot of public data on it. And although obviously folks like you have a huge reach into this, what I find obviously is that many of these family offices are intentionally private, in terms of what they're doing. So they don't want to share information for various reasons. So yeah, it's hard to get data on it, but at least anecdotally, it sounds like, we're seeing some of the same things. Mm-hmm. So listen, Farida, Ramia, I could speak to you all for hours.
Go to Clubhouse, Corey. Let's take this.
Exactly. We could do a 24-hour room.
24-hour deal room.
But in terms of a podcast, all good things need to come to an end. So in that regard, my second to last question is, if people want to find out more about you, your companies, your publications, all the stuff you do in family office, all the content you put out, what's the best place for them to go to find out more?
So first of all, thanks so much for having us here. We love your platform. We love this topic as well. And we love finding overlapping ideas with the family business space. It's so interesting to challenge it every time from a different perspective. So thanks a lot for having us here. I think the best way to engage with us and our content is probably to go check out our magazine, which is on tharawat-magazine.com. And we also have a very nice niche publication, which is dedicated to women. Another topic that I could rant on, Corey, here, it's called womeninfamilybusiness.org, which has a nice podcast too. We also have the forum that I mentioned. So Farida's the GM office is a big network of family businesses in the Middle East. It can be found at tharawat.org. And so I think those are mostly in relation to the family business team. Those are really our big portals. We have various others, but I think it'll take too long to mention. But also just hit us up. Obviously, we're on LinkedIn, we're on all social media as well. And we love having conversations with people. So please just connect with us via LinkedIn. I think LinkedIn is best. And that's a really good way to get in touch with us and see because we constantly are sharing content. So I think that's a good feed to follow, basically, to understand more about the work that we do. Yeah.
Great. And we're going to have a number of those links in the show notes, folks. So if you're driving or whenever you didn't get that, don't worry about it. Just check out the show notes. You'll be able to get access to the great content that Farida and Ramia and their various, outlets and companies are putting out. All right. So my final question of the podcast, and I'd love each of you to answer this, is freedom is my single highest value and ideal in life. And for me, that means everything from freedom for all people around the world, from oppression and discrimination, and to the reason I'm an entrepreneur and I run my own business. And, so what does freedom mean to you in your life and business? And, just what does freedom mean to each of you in your lives and business?
Oh, this is a final question. You're asking me this at the end of
you seriously? You don't know Farida at all, do you, Corey?
Sorry. This is the beginning of a 2-hour podcast.
Under 60 seconds. This is what he means when he says it's the last question. Okay?
So that's the cut to the chase. You need to condense hours of discussion into a few sentences.
Condense it. You can do it.
Okay. Let me think about this. The one thing that probably comes to mind, at the first moment, is kind of the right or the possibility to seize opportunities. And I think that for me really represents pretty much the core of how I see freedom, because what that means is it means I have tools at my disposal. I have an environment that allows me to see opportunities. I have an environment that allows me to be part of a group or, a movement that seizes that opportunity. And I mean, again, this is a 2-hour conversation at least, but there's a lot of detailed chain reactions that position me as an individual in a situation to be able to take an opportunity. And I think, we can talk about education, we can talk about discrimination, we can talk about so many different factors that would hinder a person to be in a position to seize opportunities. So I think probably, if you force me to boil it down, then I think it's that.
Thank you.
In a similar vein, I would say, and much shorter, because I'm not as eloquent as you are. Just in a shorter way, I would say probably similarly. Freedom to me is to receive the kind of respect that allows me to unlock my full potential without being worried that I will be punished for it or persecuted for it, basically. I think that's the ultimate freedom. The ultimate freedom lies in respect, really.
Love it. Love it. I so appreciate having both of you on the Deal Quest podcast. You've just the perspective you've brought, and although this conversation cannot continue on the podcast, our conversations will continue.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much.
And thank you so much for having us, Corey. Great pleasure.
Absolutely.
Thank you for joining me on this episode of Deal Quest, where we help you understand how deal-driven growth can be your ticket to freedom. I want to invite you to a unique way to tap into the wisdom and experience of the Deal Quest community. The Deal Den is a place where entrepreneurs, high-level executives, and business leaders come together, support each other's growth and success, and share what's working best, as well as what challenges we are facing right now. You will get input not only from me, but from all of our members. We collaborate and serve each other. To join us, go to corykupfer.com/dealden. I'll see you there. I'm Corey Kupfer. Until next week, wishing you the freedom and financial prosperity that I know your Deal Quest will bring.